I'm Caitlin Stamm, University Archivist at Saint Louis University. Delighted to be here with my colleague.
I'm Katie Mascari. I'm the Associate University Archivist.
We're excited to talk to you today about a project that we undertook just last fall at the end of 2022. We've been discussing, of course, this whole conference, the needs of our users. And this project represents a real variation in the users, the donors, and the kinds of material that our university archives typically acquires and uses. We've been really listening with fascination as so many of our colleagues have been discussing the need for slowed down decision making, to confirm that the right choices are being made. I feel like this presentation and our experience kind of highlights it's a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just a bit of background about us and how we came to this collection. We're going to do the very American thing like Megan did. Our university, St. Louis University, is in St. Louis, Missouri, which is starred on the map on the left. And the very American thing is to highlight how old your university is, even though it's very, very young. So our university was founded in 1818 by the Jesuits, which makes it the oldest U.S. university west of the Mississippi River. So crucially, for the purposes of this presentation, as you can see on the map on the right from the U.S. Geological Survey, St. Louis is a hotbed of seismic activity. It sits on the new Madrid fault line, and it experiences hundreds of seismic events every year. So seismology, as we all know, it's the study of earthquakes. It's a fairly recent science. Its roots are in the mid-18th century, and it was considered a particularly apt science for Jesuits to be involved in because of its public service in mitigating the destructive effects of earthquakes, and also because the Jesuits had a real interdisciplinary training in the sciences. So the Jesuits in America formed the Jesuit Seismological Service, which was later known as the Seismological Association, and it was a cooperation of seismographic stations at Jesuit institutions in the U.S. In total, there were 38 formed before 1920. 8 of those remain active today, and our university is one of them. The foremost Jesuit seismologist, a Jesuit named James McIlwain, taught for decades at the university, and he sort of made SLU, we call our university SLU, the central Jesuit seismic station in the United States. So the university kind of took charge of earthquake material from all over the world from Jesuit stations. It continued this practice until roughly the 1960s. Some of our records go through the 1980s, which is when computer-based instruments, kind of replaced analog instruments. So it is kind of in this tradition that we approached our seismic archives project. As we all know as archivists, documenting scientific records is a challenge. In 1960, Paul Lewinson of the U.S. National Archives noted many accessioning and retention questions specifically accompanying scientific research records. At that time, Lewinson explained that in many cases regarding the hard sciences, materials like laboratory notebooks and methods and standards were not considered materially useful because they may have had unintelligible notes or data personal to the scientists. Lewinson also noted in 1960 that accessioning a large volume of material would not be necessary, and perhaps all you would need if you were an archivist would be the final result of experimentation or observation. So clearly, the understanding has changed in how we document scientific records in archives and in archival theory. So by the 1980s, archivists and scientists began considering more closely the necessity of documenting the process of science, as opposed to simply the results of science. As Kalpana Shankar notes in 2004 in her article, Record Keeping and the Production of Scientific Knowledge, keeping scientific records is information infrastructure. These records are the building blocks of other kinds of scientific and archival projects. And as our co-presenter, Anne-Fleur Laloe, writes, laboratory notebooks, email exchanges, or prototype instruments, this is the evidence of how science is actually being done. Even in the 1960s, when American archivists were considering not collecting a lot of material, there was already acknowledgement that seismic records are often in a different category from other kinds of scientific records because a large volume of material is necessary to make the collection useful. The long-term value of these records lies in their regularity and continuity. In 1982, UNESCO and the International Association of Seismology and Physics of the Earth's Interior, it's a very long name, noted the importance of making archives of pre-1963 seismograms available for international research, but don't actually explain how to implement this. So, of course, we know as archivists that this is a significant challenge. Because seismograms are time-bound, they can't be easily replicated or have their gaps filled in from other sources. As US seismologists Richards and Helweg note, quote, there are important phenomena with timescales that require the examination of ground motions recorded over intervals that are as long as possible. The repeat times of damaging earthquakes range from decades to more than centuries, end quote. Current research by seismologists relies on historic data from specific dates, times, and places, which is important for not only historical study, but for also projecting for future analyses and projecting for future patterns, which is why it is necessary to retain such large quantities. You don't necessarily know what dates or times will be needed until something happens. In fields like seismology, climatology, oceanography, meteorology, archival appraisal does need to be done in concert with subject level experts, and in some cases, like in ours, a collection needs to be acquired wholesale without really having the option to not accept parts of it. So it is with this challenge in mind that we approached our Earth and Atmospheric Sciences project at our university. So we're excited to present about our experience as archivists, the academic literature that we have found regarding the long-term preservation of seismic records mostly comes from seismologists themselves. So obviously the way that we approach and understand the arrangement, the description, the use of these records is markedly different from our colleagues in the hard sciences. Working with these records is a new experience for us at our university archives. We do have large science holdings in our faculty collections and in our departmental collections, but we have never accepted a collection, especially at once, of this size, scope, or record type. So Katie will tell us more about this project.
In September of 2022, the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, or EAS department at SLU, contacted the university archives about an unexpected and obligatory project, accepting several thousand linear feet of seismic records from the early 1900s through the 1990s. The collection consists largely of seismograms from 3 Jesuit seismic stations in the state of Missouri. The records needed to be moved from a basement storage space by early January 2023, as the building that they were stored in had been reclassified, and the space was needed for a rapidly growing department. With a mandate from our university administration, we had 10 weeks to accession, arrange, house, and move these records. As Japanese, thank you. As Japanese seismologists noted in 2020, in many seismological institutes, most of the valuable seismograms of major earthquakes were treated as if they were personal effects of a professor. This is evidenced in how these materials were stored and cared for over decades at SLU. While they have clear historical and intellectual value, until this point, the records had served mostly as the passion project of one of our retired seismologists and had been moved several times over the decades. He had a deep personal investment in the records, and while our assistance was necessary for the ongoing preservation of these records, he was incredibly suspicious of our questions and concerns. And as you can see in these images, the items were stored in this labyrinth of tightly packed shelves. They were very difficult to get to, and you really didn't have any idea of what you were pulling off of a shelf. There were several considerations to evaluate as we planned for this project, one being the physical condition. As I said, the records were stored in heavily repaired and damaged envelopes and boxes in every corner of the room. It was difficult to pull out the envelopes from the shelves to see what they were. Some were stored in boxes that had once housed the blank paper that they were printed on, which was very acidic and in poor condition. Most had been taped and repaired over almost a century of use and abuse. Others had been put into these large acidic manila envelopes, most of which had been seriously deteriorating over time. Within each box and envelope, the records were stored roughly chronologically, but the records were stored in no particular order throughout the storage space. Seismograms from several different locations produced in different decades could be stored one on top of the other. We also looked at our user needs. The records were known by the international seismological community, but were not available or accessible to the academic community because there was no understanding of what the collection actually contained beyond what this professor knew from years of his own experience. For our project partners, the EAS department had high hopes for this project, including a database and fully digitized collection. This mirrors the project plans noted by other seismologist scholarship who call for scanning and digitization, as well as databases noting seismic metadata, but we do not have the bandwidth for such a project. While digitization has been carried out in various European and Asian institutions, this requires significant purpose-driven funding, staffing, and equipment, which we do not have. We also had to take into consideration what's actually feasible with this time. In considering who would be carrying out the work, we knew that we would be shouldering the heaviest burden. Our colleagues in EAS did not understand the full scope of what they were asking of us. We knew we would have the assistance of some EAS graduate students and that some of the moving would be performed by professional movers. With records from a number of locations, we determined that everyone involved would need to be able to quickly and easily recognize which materials they were working with, and we needed solutions that would not be too time-consuming. We decided to label multiple ends of the boxes with pre-filled labels with space for handwritten dates and box and folder numbers. And we purchased multiple rolls of colored dot stickers, which are commonly used for garage sales or flea markets, to demarcate records from each of the 3 seismic stations. You can see that with the red dot up there. With such limited time, we implemented a 3-stage process for addressing the needs of these records: organizing, rehousing and relabeling, and then moving. Our first phase was to organize. In conversations with our university seismologists, we were told there were several critical pieces of information that differentiated the records and needed to be considered when storing and organizing them, including the direction of ground movement, the type and manufacturer of instrument, the time, the location, and more. It was often difficult to determine if we were making the right or wrong decisions because we were being told so many factors and were essential for findability and usability. Based on our analysis, and with very limited time to consider and reconsider our choices, we determined to prioritize organizing records by seismic station and then chronologically within it. This has turned out to be the optimal choice. As per a 2020 article by seismologist Mascari and others, any classifications other than time that you believe to be useful often obstruct future researchers in finding records, and that records of different stations should be stored separately. We are fortunate that we made the right call at that time and trusted our archival intuition. We then rehoused and relabeled things. We would not have been able to complete this project without the use of an empty laboratory classroom. We used the oversized lab tables in every available corner of the lab to lay out the envelopes and boxes in chronological order. By the end of the process, we had not only used every surface in the lab, but had also used all the chairs to hold records and even filled a smaller second laboratory. As we slowly made our way through the room and unpacked the shelves, we were overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of paper. Once we began boxing, we anticipated we would be able to move quickly. We were wrong. We found it was quickest to work in an assembly line of 4 people, one to pull records from envelopes, one to put those records into folders and label them, one to put the folders in boxes and label the box, and then one to apply our color-coded stickers and shelve the boxes in chronological order. However, it was often difficult to find so much assistance as the semester had ended and we were racing against the clock. We were very fortunate to have generous colleagues from all over the library offer to help us, as well as some other student workers in the libraries. Finally, the move. We worked up to the minute that our mover showed up to remove the boxes. Although they had been repeatedly told what to expect, the movers misunderstood the directions they were given and thought that they would be moving 10 boxes instead of over 1,000. The movers also refused to place materials on the shelves and instead planned to drop the boxes on the floor. This would have been fine, as we could direct EAS graduate students once the semester started to organize materials chronologically on the shelves in the new storage space. However, when we arrived on the day we moved, we learned that the empty storage space that had been promised to us by our administrators had been filled with other items from other units undergoing construction. Clearly, this room was in high demand. With no available floor space, we had no option but to start shelving boxes anywhere we could find space. Once all the materials had been moved over, we then had to reshelve all the materials in some semblance of order. By this time, we were at our deadline, which was 10 weeks. The materials had been organized, rehoused, and reshelved in a new location.
So we had some challenges. Our first, of course, is just a lack of subject knowledge. Neither of us are scientists, and we'd never worked with materials like this before, so it took significant time to research and familiarize ourselves with the various instruments and the terminology and the acronyms at a non-technical level, as well as time to assess what would actually be useful for researchers. Because there was this professor who was intimately involved, he was pretty unwilling to explain to us how people actually used them. He was afraid we were going to try to throw everything out. He didn't realize we were on the same side. The sheer volume of material we had to take on was a shock to us. Not being able to perform any kind of a standard appraisal was very little that was being reduced from the collection was challenging, and we knew that we needed to get our choices right the first time because we were not going to be going back and redoing this next year. This ties into our next challenge, which is just communicating with non-archivists. Like many non-archivists, the EAS department assumed that we would simply take the materials and that would be it. They had no idea what they were asking of us and the time, the expense, the labor it would be for us to take on this collection. once we explained how it would work, they were still kind of pushing back on what we were explaining. Initially, we had been told that the records were in chronological order, but we quickly discovered that wasn't the case, which added over a week's time that we didn't have to try and reorganize the records. Our biggest challenge, of course, was our tight schedule. This constraint couldn't be changed, so the scope and the budget had to compensate for it. We manipulated the scope of the project to the best of our ability by prioritizing rehousing the most fragile documents first, and then dealing with other records as we could later. Ultimately, the budget and resources did have to compensate for this. We spent significantly more to rush order materials, and we weren't able to take the time necessary to properly calculate material quantities. And due to the schedule, and we are a department of 3, now we're a department of 2, we were forced to essentially close the archives for researchers and queries for 2 months, which limited access to our normal users. We didn't have suitable storage space for the records, but after several months, our provost's office located a temporary space. We can be using that for 9 months until something more permanent can be found. We've kind of barely caught our breath from completing this phase 1, and we're aware that we're quickly approaching the summertime deadline for finding a new space, so wish us luck. And then finally, while we had negotiated with our vendor to have supplies arrive in multiple shipments so we could move on to rehousing as quickly as possible, the vendor actually shipped everything together, which meant we received 1,000 empty boxes and 4,000 folders at once, completely filling our commercial loading dock. So while unloading these supplies, we hit a breaking point. This was the saddest day of my life, when the weight of several hundred folders caused the table they were on to collapse, meaning we had to remove the things we had just moved. That was a bad day.
It really was. So there were several failures that I would consider we encountered with this project. One of which being
Successes.
We do success.
No,
We
failures.
forgot about our
Sorry.
failures.
I was excited to move on.
Yeah, no, we failed. We failed a few times to properly manage expectations for this project, with the biggest being our budget. Whenever we tried to discuss the costs of rehousing the materials with our colleagues, we were told, it's not a problem, we have the money for this. Once we got accurate quotes for supplies, however, it did become a problem. The opaqueness of the department's budget and what they thought was expensive versus what we thought was expensive was comical. Luckily, the provost's office filled in any needed gaps, but between the custom folders, custom boxes, 2 sets of professional movers, as well as another potential move in the future, this project was considerably more expensive than they anticipated. We struggled to determine how many boxes and folders we would need for this project, and had very little time to actually deliberate. We needed to order supplies quickly so we would have a few weeks to rehouse and relabel. Because we did not have a good way of ascertaining the actual quantity of materials, and we were very rushed, we miscalculated. We under-ordered boxes, and we over-ordered folders by quite a bit.
If anyone needs folders, we have a lot.
One failure we narrowly avoided was ordering the incorrect size boxes. We luckily had a sample sent, and we were able to check to make sure it actually worked. It didn't, so then we had to go back to the drawing board and have the size kind of fixed, but always get a sample. Success-wise, there were successes. We had strong administrator support. We were well supported by the provost's office. They helped with funding and found new storage spaces. In his annual remarks to the library this year, the provost mentioned how important this project was and how impressed he was working with the university archives. Taking on a non-standard collection and working with atypical research users was also an excellent opportunity for advocacy outside of our usual methods. It also allowed us to build new relationships. In addition to developing positive relationships with administrators and stakeholders, we are developing relationships with potential new users through this process. In taking on a collection, we are opening the archives up to more STEM-focused users, expanding our reach. As we begin to properly describe and make public these records in our finding aids, it is important to continue to build and maintain these relationships. And as so many of us already know, one aspect crucial to our ongoing process is developing strong ties to the facility staff and building operations staff. Without their help, advice, and coordination of logistics, like continual trash removal, we would not have been able to do this project. We also just learned to simplify and roll with the punches. We simplified our labels. We thought we'd be writing so much more on them. We found that the easiest answer is often the best answer, and using a big whiteboard and color coding in primary colors was the way that we used to work out most of our issues.
So with our last minute, just to kind of talk about what's next, obviously the items need to be moved again, hopefully for good. We're excited to make them available to the academic community, and we hope to see how they're used, but this will require us, of course, to describe them and figure out that. So that's phase 2. We've already started using these in courses that are not related to seismology. For example, a course last semester in the English department on environmental sensing, which was a really unique way of using this. And we look forward to expanding in the collection into more what we would consider standard manuscript collections, including the photo here of postcards that local St. Louisans would fill out to track their experience of feeling an earthquake, which was part of a large-scale governmental citizen science project. So thank you so much. We're thrilled to be here, and we look forward to hearing what's next.